Walter Kelly was 44 years old and worked as a courthouse maintenance supervisor in Denver, Colorado. Most people saw a man in faded work jackets driving an aging Ford F-150 and carrying the same metal lunchbox every morning before sunrise. They believed his wife, Lauren Kelly, had built everything while he simply followed behind. What they didn't know was that Walter had spent 7 months preparing for the day she decided to destroy him in public. When Lauren entered the family courtroom, flanked by 2 attorneys and a crowd of curious spectators turned toward him, Walter quietly placed a single cream-colored envelope on the table. Then the judge opened it. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your country and your local time in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories about quiet strength, hidden truths, and the moments when facts speak louder than words, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter of Walter Kelly's story. The first people to arrive at the Lindsay Flanagan courthouse every morning were usually security officers. The second was Walter Kelly. At 5:37 a.m., while downtown Denver was still dark, and the streets around Colfax Avenue carried only a handful of delivery trucks, Walter parked his aging blue Ford F-150 in the employee lot and stepped out carrying a black metal lunchbox. For 14 years his routine had barely changed. Unlock the maintenance office, check the boiler logs, inspect the electrical panels, walk every floor before court opened. Most people never noticed him. That was the nature of his job. If everything worked, nobody remembered who made it work. Walter preferred it that way. He wasn't a man who chased attention. He wasn't active on social media. He didn't attend networking breakfasts. He didn't care who appeared in local business magazines. At 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and permanently rough hands, he looked more like a construction foreman than someone connected to the world of investors and luxury developments. His co-workers liked him. Judge Harrison knew him by name. Court clerks trusted him. Deputies greeted him every morning, yet almost none of them knew much about his life outside work. Walter rarely talked about himself. He listened more than he spoke. He fixed things, then he went home. Or at least that was what people assumed. For years, the public face of the Kelly marriage had belonged entirely to Lauren Kelly. Lauren was everywhere. Her face appeared in Denver Business Journal articles. She spoke at commercial development conferences. She sat on charity boards. She attended fundraising galas. By 41, she had become one of the fastest-rising real estate developers in Colorado. People admired her confidence, they admired her ambition, and they admired the story she carefully allowed them to believe. Lauren, the successful entrepreneur, Walter, the quiet maintenance worker. A surprising couple, an unequal couple, at least from the outside. Walter never corrected anyone. When people assumed Lauren paid for everything, he remained silent. When people joked that he had married above his station, he simply smiled. The truth never seemed worth explaining. Not because he was ashamed, because he had learned something years ago. The louder people talked, the less they usually knew. By the time Walter reached his office that morning, he had already completed his first inspection route. He poured coffee into an old ceramic mug and sat behind his desk. The office was small, no windows, gray filing cabinets, a desk scarred by years of use. A framed photograph sat beside the computer monitor. It showed Walter and Lauren standing in front of Red Rocks Amphitheater nearly 11 years earlier. They looked happy. Lauren was laughing. Walter had his arm around her shoulders. The picture had been taken 6 months before their wedding. Walter stared at it for several seconds, not because he missed those days. Not exactly. He was trying to remember when things had started changing. The shift hadn't happened all at once. There had been no dramatic argument, no obvious betrayal, just small changes, tiny fractures, the kind people ignored until the foundation underneath them began to crack. Lauren started coming home later. Then she started traveling more frequently, business meetings, development conferences, investor dinners. At first, Walter believed her. Why wouldn't he? She had worked hard for her success. He had supported every step of it. When she launched her first development company, he celebrated with her. When she signed her first major commercial contract, he bought champagne. When she worked weekends, he handled everything at home. He never kept score. Marriage wasn't supposed to be a scoreboard. But over time, something changed in Lauren's attitude. Walter noticed it in small moments. A sigh when he arrived at an event wearing work clothes. An impatient look when he spoke to her business associates. A correction whenever someone referred to them as a team. She no longer said we, she said I. I built this company. I closed that deal. I purchased that property. The words became more frequent every year. Then came the locked office. Their house in Cherry Creek had a second-floor room Lauren used for work. For years the door remained open. Then one day, it wasn't. A keypad appeared. Lauren never mentioned it. Walter never asked. Not because he wasn't curious, because he was paying attention. Questions often caused people to become careful. Silence encouraged them to become comfortable. Comfortable people revealed more. Months later, another change appeared. Lauren stopped leaving her phone unattended. The device followed her everywhere. Kitchen, bedroom, patio, bathroom, everywhere. Again, Walter said nothing. Instead, he observed, the same way he observed electrical systems before they failed. Small symptoms always appeared before major problems. You just had to notice them. One Friday afternoon, Walter left work early. A contractor had canceled a scheduled inspection, giving him a rare free evening. He decided to surprise Lauren. There was a charity fundraiser at the Denver Art Museum that night. Lauren had mentioned it weeks earlier. Walter put on a navy blazer and drove home. When he arrived, Lauren wasn't there. Her assistant answered the phone. "Oh," the woman said awkwardly. "I thought Lauren told you." "Told me what?" A pause, another uncomfortable silence. "The guest list was finalized yesterday." Walter stood beside his kitchen counter, looking out toward the backyard, listening. "What guest list?" "The fundraiser." More silence. Then the assistant spoke carefully. "Your name isn't on it." Walter thanked her, hung up, and stood motionless for nearly a minute. Not angry, not shocked, just thinking. The fundraiser was hosting nearly 400 guests. There was room for governors, developers, investors, and donors, but apparently not for Lauren's husband. That night he didn't attend. He didn't call Lauren. He didn't ask for an explanation. Instead, he sat on the back patio watching airplanes descend toward Denver International Airport. At 10:47 p.m., Lauren finally came home. Walter heard the garage door. He heard her footsteps. He heard her heels click across hardwood floors. She entered the kitchen carrying a designer handbag. "You're still awake." Walter looked up from his coffee. "Yeah." "The fundraiser went well." "I heard." Lauren paused, only briefly, then continued unpacking her things. No explanation, no apology, nothing. That told Walter more than words could have, because people always explained accidents. They rarely explained choices, and removing a spouse from a guest list wasn't an accident. It was a decision, a deliberate one, a message. Walter finished his coffee, rose from his chair, and quietly carried his mug to the sink. Lauren continued scrolling through her phone. She never noticed the way he looked at her, not with anger, not with sadness, with recognition. For the first time, Walter realized something important. He wasn't being pushed aside by circumstance. He was being removed intentionally, piece by piece, event by event, conversation by conversation. And if that was true, then someone was already planning a future that didn't include him. What Walter didn't know yet was how far that planning had already gone, or that less than 3 weeks later, a luxury ballroom at the Brown Palace Hotel would reveal the first piece of a much larger betrayal. 3 weeks after the charity fundraiser, Lauren invited Walter to attend a networking dinner at the Brown Palace Hotel. The invitation surprised him, not because she wanted him there, because she had spent months making sure he wasn't. The message arrived on a Wednesday evening while Walter was replacing a faulty lighting panel on the 3rd floor of the courthouse. "Investor dinner this Friday," Lauren texted. "Would be good if you came." That was all. No heart emoji, no explanation, no warmth, just a sentence. Walter stared at the screen for several seconds before slipping the phone back into his pocket. Something about the invitation felt unusual, not wrong, just deliberate, as though she suddenly needed him present for a reason. He accepted. Friday evening arrived cold and windy. Downtown Denver glittered beneath a blanket of winter lights. The Brown Palace Hotel stood exactly as it had for generations, elegant, historic, filled with people who enjoyed being seen. Walter parked his truck several blocks away and walked the remaining distance. He wore his only tailored suit, navy blue, nearly 6 years old, perfectly maintained. Inside the hotel, crystal chandeliers reflected golden light across polished marble floors. Investors, developers, bank executives, political donors. The room contained the kind of people Lauren had spent years trying to impress. Walter immediately noticed how differently she moved in this environment. At home, she was often distracted, restless, impatient. Here she was confident, controlled, commanding. Lauren belonged to this room, or at least, she wanted everyone to believe she did. When she spotted Walter near the entrance, she smiled, a professional smile, not a wife's smile. She approached with a glass of wine in her hand. "You made it." Walter nodded. "You asked me to." Lauren glanced toward a group gathered near the ballroom windows. "Come meet some people." Walter followed. The introductions began immediately. Names, companies, investments, projects. Most lasted only a few seconds. Then came the moment Walter would remember long after the marriage ended. Lauren stopped beside 3 investors from Phoenix. One of them asked casually, "And who is this?" Walter waited. The answer should have been simple. "My husband." 2 words, nothing complicated. Instead, Lauren laughed lightly. "Oh, this is Walter." A pause. "He's a maintenance supervisor at the courthouse." The investors nodded politely. One shook Walter's hand, another smiled. The conversation moved forward. But something important had just happened. Lauren had answered the question without actually answering it. No mention of husband, no mention of marriage, no mention of 11 years together, just Walter, the maintenance supervisor. Walter noticed. More importantly, he noticed she did it again, and again, and again. Each introduction followed the same pattern. Never husband, never spouse, never partner, only occupation, only status. Only the smallest version of him she could present. Most people wouldn't have caught it. Walter did, because patterns mattered. Patterns revealed intent. About 40 minutes later, another man joined the group. Tall, expensive suit, perfect haircut, confident smile. Grant Sullivan. Walter recognized the name immediately. One of Lauren's investment partners. He had heard it dozens of times during the previous year. Grant greeted Lauren first, not with a handshake. With familiarity, a little too much familiarity. He touched her elbow. She laughed before he even finished speaking. Their timing felt practiced, comfortable, the kind of comfort built through repetition. Walter watched. Nothing more, nothing less. The evening continued. Conversations shifted between commercial projects and development opportunities. Walter contributed occasionally. Most people seemed surprised when he spoke. Not because he lacked intelligence, because they had assumed he lacked it. Years of working around judges and attorneys had taught Walter how to read people. Many entered a room believing they could identify everyone's value within 30 seconds. They were usually wrong. Grant was one of those people. At one point, he looked Walter up and down. "Lauren says you've worked at the courthouse forever." 14 years, Grant smiled. "Must be nice. Stable job, no headaches." Walter took a sip of water. Every job has headaches. Several people laughed. Grant didn't. He preferred being the one making the jokes. The conversation moved on. Yet Walter kept observing. The closer he looked, the more unusual details appeared. Lauren and Grant seemed to know each other's movements before they happened. They finished each other's stories. They exchanged looks across the room, small things. Easy to dismiss individually. Difficult to ignore collectively. Then Walter noticed something else, something much harder to explain. Grant was wearing silver cufflinks, simple, elegant, distinctive. Walter recognized them instantly. His stomach tightened, not from anger, from certainty. 3 years earlier, Walter had purchased a custom anniversary gift for Lauren, a pair of engraved sterling silver cufflinks, their initials, L and K. Lauren had laughed when she opened the box. She told him they were beautiful. Then she claimed she would keep them as a keepsake because she never wore cufflinks. Months later, they disappeared. She said she misplaced them. Walter believed her. Now one of those cufflinks was attached to Grant Sullivan's sleeve. The engraving wasn't visible from a distance, but the unique design was unmistakable. Walter stared for a moment, then looked away. He didn't confront Grant. He didn't confront Lauren. because confrontation would only produce explanations. Walter wanted information. Information was always more valuable. The opportunity arrived unexpectedly. Near the end of the evening, Lauren was called away by another investor. Grant stepped outside to answer a phone call. The group dispersed. Walter found himself standing alone near a side conference room. The door was partially open. Inside, someone had been preparing presentation materials. A projector, coffee cups, folders, laptops, nothing unusual. Walter wasn't snooping, at least not intentionally. Then he noticed a familiar logo on one of the open folders. Sullivan Development Partners, Grant's company. Beside it sat another folder bearing Lauren's firm's logo. Several pages were exposed. One page contained property acquisition schedules. Another contained partnership distributions. Walter glanced once, then twice. His attention sharpened. A specific address caught his eye. Not because he knew the property, because he recognized the legal structure attached to it. It referenced a trust entity, a trust name he hadn't expected to see connected to Lauren's projects. Walter stepped into the room, only for a moment, long enough to pull out his phone, long enough to photograph 3 pages, then 4, then 5, no more than 20 seconds. The sound of footsteps approached from the hallway. Walter slipped the phone away and exited calmly. Nobody stopped him. Nobody noticed. Back inside the ballroom, Lauren was smiling for photographs. Grant stood beside her. Investors applauded some announcement about an upcoming development project. Walter watched from across the room. The photographs on his phone felt heavier than they should, not because they proved anything, not yet, but because they raised questions. Questions that hadn't existed before tonight. Questions involving money, property, ownership, and legal structures that should not have been connected in the way he had just seen. For the first time, Walter began to suspect the problem was bigger than an unhappy marriage. Much bigger. As the event ended, Lauren approached him. "You ready to go?" Walter looked at her, then at Grant across the room, then back at Lauren. "Yeah." The drive home was quiet. Lauren talked about investors, future projects, potential expansion opportunities. Walter listened, occasionally nodding, never mentioning the cufflink, never mentioning the photographs, never mentioning the folder, because something told him this wasn't the night for answers. This was the night for observation. Answers would come later, and when they did, they would be supported by facts, not assumptions, not accusations, not emotions. As they pulled into their driveway just after 11 o'clock, Walter already knew one thing. The photographs he had taken inside the Brown Palace Hotel were not going to stay buried in his phone for long, and within a month, those images would lead him directly to the divorce papers Lauren had already prepared behind his back. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday, not by mail, not through a difficult conversation, not after counseling, not after an argument. They arrived through a process server standing outside the employee entrance of the Lindsay Flanagan Courthouse at 7:12 in the morning. Walter had just finished checking an electrical panel on the second floor when a deputy informed him someone was waiting downstairs. He assumed it was a contractor, maybe a delivery. Instead, he found a man in a gray suit holding a large envelope. "Walter Kelly." Walter nodded. The man handed him the documents. "You've been served." Then he walked away, just like that. No explanation, no apology, no hesitation. Walter stood in the courthouse lobby for several seconds. People moved around him. Attorneys hurried toward elevators. Security officers greeted arriving staff. Nobody paid attention. To everyone else, it was just another envelope. To Walter, it felt like the final confirmation of something he had already known. Lauren had been planning this for a long time. He carried the documents to his office and closed the door. The packet was thick, nearly 80 pages. The first page contained the petition for dissolution of marriage filed in Denver County Family Court. Lauren Kelly listed as petitioner. Walter Kelly listed as respondent. The date caught his attention immediately. The filing had been prepared almost 3 weeks earlier. 3 weeks, before the Brown Palace dinner, before Lauren had invited him to attend, before she smiled for photographs beside him. before she sat across from him at dinner, pretending everything was normal. The realization settled heavily. The networking event hadn't been an attempt to repair anything. It had been theater, a performance. She already knew the marriage was over. She simply hadn't informed him yet. Walter continued reading. The deeper he went, the stranger the documents became. The petition wasn't simply requesting a divorce. It was constructing a narrative, a carefully engineered story. According to the filing, Lauren had been the primary financial provider throughout the marriage. Lauren had built her business independently. Lauren had acquired major assets through her personal efforts. Lauren had allegedly supported a husband whose contributions had been limited. Walter paused, read the sentence again, then a third time. Not because he was angry, because he was impressed. The language was precise, careful, designed to create an image without directly lying. A skilled attorney had written it. Actually, 2 skilled attorneys. Their names appeared near the end of the filing. Cynthia Prescott, Ethan Brooks. Walter knew both names. Anyone involved in Colorado family law knew them. Cynthia specialized in high-asset divorces. Ethan was known for aggressive litigation. They were expensive, very expensive. The kind of attorneys hired when someone intended to win publicly, not simply legally. Walter continued reading. Then he reached the financial demands. That was where things changed. The document requested access to multiple assets, investment accounts, retirement funds, property interests, business holdings. Some requests were expected, others were astonishing. Walter slowly leaned back in his chair, his eyes focused on a specific paragraph. The attorneys were attempting to classify several commercial properties as marital assets, properties connected to entities Lauren should not have known much about. Properties tied to trust structures established years before the marriage, properties Walter rarely discussed. Even with Lauren, especially with Lauren, the request itself wasn't proof of wrongdoing. People often made aggressive claims during divorce, but something felt off, very off. The filing referenced details that appeared unusually specific, almost as though someone had been searching for information, trying to locate assets they didn't fully understand. Walter reached for his phone, then opened the photographs he had taken at the Brown Palace Hotel. The same trust name appeared, the same legal entity, the same property address. Now the pieces were beginning to align, slowly, carefully, but clearly. At 11:18 a.m., Lauren called. Walter watched the phone vibrate, then answered. "Hi." Lauren's voice sounded unusually calm, as if they were discussing a utility bill. "You received the paperwork." "Yes." A brief silence followed. Then Lauren sighed. "I think this is best." Walter said nothing. She continued. "We've grown apart." Still nothing. "The attorneys have already prepared a settlement proposal." Walter glanced toward the stack of papers. "I noticed. You should review it." "I will." Another pause. Lauren seemed almost frustrated by his lack of reaction. People often expected anger, arguments, defensiveness. Walter offered none. Finally, she spoke again. "This doesn't have to become difficult." Walter looked out the small office window. Snow was beginning to fall over downtown Denver. "Difficult for who?" The silence that followed lasted longer. Then Lauren answered. "For either of us." Walter thanked her for calling, then ended the conversation. No argument, no accusation, no discussion. Because at that moment he understood something important. Lauren believed she was ahead, not just ahead, far ahead. She believed the outcome had already been decided. The paperwork reflected that confidence. The settlement proposal reflected it. The choice of attorneys reflected it. Everything reflected it. That confidence interested Walter more than anything else. Confident people made mistakes. Overconfident people made expensive mistakes. By Thursday evening, copies of the divorce filing had already circulated through portions of Lauren's social circle. Walter learned this accidentally. A courthouse clerk named Linda approached him during lunch. "I heard about your divorce." Walter looked up, surprised. He hadn't told anyone. Linda immediately realized her mistake. "Oh," her expression changed. "You didn't know people were talking about it?" Walter set down his coffee. "No." Linda hesitated, then lowered her voice. There was a fundraiser Monday night. Walter already knew where this was going. Several of Lauren's friends had apparently discussed the situation openly. Not details, just enough. Lauren was finally leaving. Lauren deserved happiness. Lauren had carried the marriage for years. Lauren had sacrificed everything. Walter listened quietly. The stories traveled quickly because they were simple. Simple stories always spread fastest. Successful wife, average husband, predictable divorce. People rarely question narratives that matched their assumptions. By the weekend, Walter noticed another development. Several mutual acquaintances stopped returning calls. One canceled dinner plans, another postponed a golf outing. A third sent a polite text message explaining he needed space from the situation. Walter wasn't surprised. Sides were already being chosen. Most had chosen Lauren's, not because they knew the facts, because they knew her public image, and public images often defeated reality, for a while. Saturday morning, Walter drove west toward Lakewood. The snowstorm from earlier in the week had cleared. The roads were dry, traffic was light. He exited 6th Avenue and parked outside a small brick office building. Nothing about the building looked impressive. No marble lobby, no expensive signage, no luxury conference rooms. The directory listed accountants, insurance agents, and a handful of law firms. Walter entered, took the elevator to the 3rd floor, and stopped outside the modest suite. The brass plaque beside the door read, Hayes Family Law. He entered. A receptionist greeted him. 10 minutes later, Walter sat across from Rebecca Hayes. She appeared to be in her early 50s, professional, focused. No unnecessary warmth, no unnecessary coldness. The office walls contained shelves filled with legal binders, nothing decorative, everything practical. Rebecca opened the divorce petition, spent 20 minutes reading, then another 20 reviewing supporting documents. Her expression changed gradually, not dramatically, just enough for Walter to notice. Finally, she looked up. Mr. Kelly. Walter is fine, Rebecca nodded. Walter, this is not a standard divorce. No. It stopped being standard before these papers were filed. Walter remained silent. Rebecca tapped one particular section. The asset claims concern me. Why? Because someone is reaching for things they don't fully understand. Walter leaned slightly forward. Rebecca closed the file. Before I tell you what I think, she folded her hands, I need you to answer one question honestly. Walter nodded. Rebecca's eyes locked onto his. What exactly are they trying to take? Walter held her gaze for several seconds. Then he opened the briefcase he had brought with him. Inside sat a collection of documents he had not yet shown anyone. Tax records, trust records, property filings, corporate formation papers, years of documentation. Carefully organized, carefully preserved. Rebecca watched as he placed the first folder on her desk, then the second, then the third, and for the first time since this process began, someone other than Walter was about to discover what Lauren Kelly had overlooked for 11 years. Rebecca Hayes spent nearly 40 minutes reading without saying a word. Walter sat across from her desk and waited. The office was silent except for the occasional turning of a page. Outside the window, afternoon traffic moved along West Colfax Avenue. Inside, Rebecca's attention never left the documents. The first folder contained property records. The second contained trust documents. The third contained corporate filings dating back nearly 15 years. Every few minutes she stopped, reread a section, made a note, then continued. Walter had seen that look before. Judges wore it when testimony stopped matching evidence. Investigators wore it when a case suddenly became larger than expected. Eventually, Rebecca removed her glasses and leaned back. For several seconds, she simply stared at Walter, not with suspicion, with curiosity. You've been holding on to these records for a long time. Walter nodded. My father taught me to keep everything. I'm beginning to appreciate your father. A faint smile crossed Walter's face. Rebecca returned her attention to the files. What exactly does Lauren know about these assets? Not much. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. Not much. She knew I owned some commercial properties. Some? Walter nodded again. Not all. Rebecca looked back down at the documents. The deeper she examined them, the more remarkable the picture became. Years before Walter met Lauren, He had established a legal entity called Mercer Commercial Trust. The name came from his mother's family, Mercer. The trust had been formed legally, documented properly, funded before the marriage, protected before the marriage, and managed carefully for more than a decade. It owned warehouse properties, industrial lots, storage facilities, commercial leases, nothing glamorous, nothing flashy, no luxury towers, no penthouses, no magazine covers, just steady income-producing assets, the kind investors respected, the kind most people overlooked, which was exactly why Walter liked them. Rebecca flipped through another file, then another, then another. Finally, she stopped. "Do you know approximately what this trust is worth?" Walter shrugged slightly. "Depends on the market." Rebecca didn't smile. "Walter," he sighed. "Last appraisal was around 12 million. The room became quiet. Rebecca looked at him, then looked at the documents, then looked back at him. $12 million. Approximately. And you're working as a courthouse maintenance supervisor? Yes. Rebecca blinked. She had spent more than 25 years practicing family law. Very little surprised her anymore. This surprised her. Not because of the money, because of the man. People with assets of that size typically wanted others to know. Bigger houses, luxury vehicles, country club memberships, visible status. Walter had none of those things. Rebecca glanced at the file again. "You could retire." "I could." "Why don't you—" Walter answered immediately. "I like my job." The simplicity of the response made Rebecca laugh softly, not mockingly, genuinely. "You're unusual. I hear that occasionally." Rebecca continued reviewing the records. The story slowly emerged. Walter's father had operated a small commercial maintenance company in Denver. Nothing major, just a hard-working business. Years earlier, an industrial downturn had created opportunities. Old warehouses were being sold cheaply. Most investors ignored them. Walter's father didn't. He bought one, then another, then another. Walter helped manage them after work, weekends, evenings, holidays. The income wasn't dramatic at first, but over time the properties appreciated. Tenants arrived, lease revenue increased, additional acquisitions followed. When Walter's father passed away, ownership transferred through carefully prepared legal structures. Everything was documented. Everything was lawful. Everything occurred years before Lauren entered Walter's life. Rebecca finally understood why the divorce petition concerned him. Lauren wasn't merely requesting a larger settlement. She was reaching toward assets she apparently believed were marital property. Assets she did not legally own. Assets she may not have fully understood. Has Lauren ever reviewed these trust records? No. Never. Never. Rebecca considered that. Then another question occurred to her. Why not? Walter looked toward the office window. For a moment his expression changed. Not anger. Something quieter, older. Because she never asked. The answer lingered between them. Rebecca understood immediately. People revealed what interested them. Apparently, Lauren had never been interested. Not really. The conversation shifted towards strategy. Rebecca explained Colorado marital property law, trust protections, asset classifications, disclosure requirements. Walter listened carefully. He had spent years around courtrooms. Legal language didn't intimidate him. What mattered was evidence, and evidence appeared to favor him, at least for now. Then Rebecca reached the section involving Lauren's claims. The mood changed. Her expression tightened. She reread several pages, then turned them toward Walter. "Look at this." Walter studied the document. One paragraph referenced beneficial ownership interests. Another referenced trust participation rights. A third suggested Walter had voluntarily merged separate assets into marital property. Rebecca tapped the page. "These statements concern me." "Why?" "Because someone supplied information that isn't entirely accurate." Walter remained silent. Rebecca continued. "I can't prove intent yet." But the language is unusually specific," she leaned forward. "Somebody believes they know where the money is." Walter already suspected as much. The photographs from the Brown Palace remained in his mind. The trust references, the property addresses. the unusual overlap between Lauren's business activities and assets connected to Mercer Commercial Trust. At first, those details seemed coincidental. Now they felt connected. Rebecca opened another file. "Tell me about Grant Sullivan." Walter wasn't surprised by the question. "He owns Sullivan Development Partners." "Friend?" "No." "Business partner?" "No." Rebecca studied him carefully. "Do you trust him?" Walter thought about the cufflink, the investor dinner, the familiarity, the photographs. Then he answered. "No." Rebecca nodded, as if confirming something she already suspected. The meeting lasted another hour. When it finally ended, Rebecca gathered the documents into organized stacks. Then she folded her hands. "Walter, yes. You have a strong position." Walter waited. She wasn't finished. "However," there it was, the word every attorney eventually used. "However." "Divorce cases aren't won by having the truth," Walter listened. "They're won by proving the truth." He nodded. Rebecca continued. "Cynthia Prescott didn't become one of the top divorce attorneys in Colorado by making careless mistakes. No, Ethan Brooks is aggressive. I've heard. They will pressure you." Walter wasn't worried. "They'll provoke you." Still not worried. "They'll try to create urgency." That made him smile slightly. Rebecca noticed. "What?" Walter shook his head. "They've mistaken me for someone else." Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "Meaning?" Walter looked at the folders stacked across her desk. The records, the trust, the years of documentation, the evidence. Then he answered. "They think I'll panic." Rebecca stared at him for a moment, then smiled, for the first time since the meeting began, because she finally understood something important. Lauren's attorneys had built their strategy around assumptions. Assumptions about Walter's income, assumptions about his intelligence, assumptions about his confidence, most importantly, assumptions about how he would react under pressure. Those assumptions might become their biggest problem. Rebecca stood and extended her hand. Walter shook it. "We're not going to fight emotionally," she said. "We're going to fight with records." Walter nodded. "Good." Rebecca's expression hardened slightly. "And until we know exactly what they're doing, you don't confront Lauren." "I won't." "You don't confront Grant Sullivan." "I won't." "You don't discuss these assets with anyone." "I never have." Rebecca seemed satisfied. Then she walked him toward the office door. Just before he left, she spoke one final sentence. A sentence that stayed with Walter during the drive home. "We don't argue with allegations." She paused, then added quietly, "We prove they're wrong." Walter stepped into the hallway. The office door closed behind him. For the first time since receiving the divorce papers, he felt something resembling certainty. Not victory, not yet. The situation was becoming clearer. The pieces were starting to fit, and somewhere inside Lauren's filings, Rebecca believed there was a mistake. A serious mistake. The kind that only became visible when someone stopped reacting emotionally and started examining facts. Neither of them knew exactly where that mistake was hiding. But over the next few weeks, a single signature buried inside the divorce paperwork would reveal far more than anyone expected. 3 days after meeting Rebecca Hayes, Walter found the signature. Not during a dramatic breakthrough, not after some late-night revelation. He found it on a quiet Thursday evening while sitting at the dining room table. The same table he and Lauren had purchased during their second year of marriage. The same table where they once planned vacations, discussed future goals, celebrated anniversaries. Now it held nothing except legal files, a yellow legal pad, and a cooling cup of coffee. Outside, snow drifted across the backyard. Inside, Walter methodically reviewed every page of the divorce filings for the 4th time. Rebecca had asked him to look at everything. Not just the major claims. Everything. Dates, addresses, signatures, attachments. People often focused on the obvious. Experienced investigators focused on details. Walter had learned that lesson from years spent around courtrooms. The smallest inconsistency often mattered most. Page after page passed beneath his eyes. Then he stopped. His hand remained on the document, his attention fixed on a signature line. Not because the signature looked unusual, because it looked familiar, too familiar. Walter leaned forward. His heartbeat slowed, the way it always did when something important appeared. He studied the page carefully. The document was labeled as a Trust Acknowledgement Amendment. According to the filing, Walter had signed it nearly 18 months earlier. The document appeared to show him voluntarily modifying certain ownership rights connected to Mercer Commercial Trust. Specifically, it suggested that Lauren possessed a future interest in several trust-controlled assets. Walter stared at it, then read it again and again. Something wasn't right, not emotionally, physically. The signature looked wrong. At first glance, it resembled his handwriting. Close enough to fool most people. Maybe even close enough to fool an attorney reviewing hundreds of documents. But Walter wasn't reviewing hundreds of signatures. He was reviewing his own, and he knew exactly how he signed his name. For more than 20 years, every signature followed the same pattern, the same pressure, the same angle, the same slant, the same habit of connecting the K in Kelly with a sweeping final stroke. This signature was missing that stroke, barely noticeable, but missing. Walter opened a filing cabinet, retrieved an old property closing document, placed it beside the disputed page, then another, 5 signatures, 10 signatures, 15 signatures. Every authentic example shared the same characteristics. The signature in the divorce filing did not. The difference was subtle, tiny, almost invisible, yet unmistakable. Walter took photographs and emailed them to Rebecca. 5 minutes later, his phone rang. "You found something?" Rebecca's tone wasn't a question. "No." Walter looked at the document again. "I found someone else's version of my signature." Silence followed. Then Rebecca said exactly what Walter expected. "Don't touch anything. I wasn't planning to. I'm coming in early tomorrow." The next morning, Walter arrived at her office carrying copies of everything. Rebecca spent nearly an hour comparing signatures. When she finished, she closed the file. "Either we're looking at a forgery," she paused, "or the strangest example of handwriting inconsistency I've seen in 25 years. Walter wasn't surprised. Neither possibility felt random. Rebecca continued examining the document itself. That was when another detail surfaced. The notary section. A certification stamp appeared near the bottom of the page. Standard, routine, easy to overlook. Rebecca didn't overlook it. She copied the information into her notebook. Notary name, commission number, office location, expiration date. Then she leaned back. "We verify this. How?" "We start with the notary." 2 days later, they did exactly that. The office listed on the document was located inside a commercial building near downtown Denver. A perfectly ordinary location. Professional, legitimate, the kind of place nobody would question. Rebecca sent an inquiry, then another, then requested verification records. The response arrived 48 hours later, and immediately created more questions. According to the notary's official logbook, no appointment matching Walter Kelly existed on the date listed. No signature, no identification record, nothing. The absence mattered. Notaries were required to maintain records, especially for legal documents involving trusts and property interests. This notary had no record whatsoever. Rebecca called Walter the moment she received confirmation. "That's impossible." Walter was sitting in his truck outside a warehouse tenant meeting. "What is the notarization?" Walter remained silent. Rebecca continued. "The document says you appeared in person." "I didn't. The logbook says you never appeared." "Then we know something." Rebecca's voice became colder. "We know more than something." For the first time, she sounded genuinely concerned. Not about Walter, about the case itself. Because false claims in divorce proceedings were one thing. Forged legal documents were something else entirely. The issue moved beyond aggressive litigation, beyond negotiation, beyond strategy. Now it entered dangerous territory. That evening, Walter returned home carrying copies of the disputed document. Lauren wasn't there. She had spent increasingly fewer nights at the house during recent months. Another fact Walter had quietly documented. He sat in the study and examined the papers again. The more he looked, the less accidental everything seemed. The trust references, the property claims, the investor connections, the forged signature. Each piece pointed toward the same conclusion. Someone wanted access to assets. Someone had become frustrated by legal barriers, and someone appeared willing to create paperwork that removed those barriers. The question wasn't whether the signature was false anymore. The question was how it had been created. Hours later, while organizing old records, Walter remembered something, a seemingly insignificant memory. Several years earlier, Lauren had asked to borrow his passport. At the time, she claimed she needed identification information for an international development conference registration. The request seemed harmless. Walter handed it over. Days later, she returned it. Nothing appeared unusual back then. Now he wondered, not because he believed the passport itself mattered, because of what accompanied it. The passport had been stored inside a personal records binder. That binder contained copies of numerous legal documents, property records, trust records, historical signatures, old filings, everything. Walter sat motionless, thinking. Memory after memory surfaced. Small moments, overlooked moments, moments that seemed irrelevant when they happened. Rebecca always said patterns mattered. Walter was beginning to see a pattern. The next week, she arranged for a forensic document examiner, one of the most respected handwriting specialists in Colorado. The expert requested samples, lots of samples, known signatures, historic signatures, recent signatures, digital scans, original documents. Walter provided everything. Then they waited. Waiting frustrated many people, not Walter. Patience was one of the reasons Mercer Commercial Trust existed in the first place. Patience built things. Impatience destroyed them. 10 days passed, then 11, then 12. On the 13th night, Walter was asleep when his phone rang. 12:18 a.m. The screen displayed Rebecca Hayes. Walter answered immediately. Lawyers didn't call after midnight with routine updates. "Rebecca, you awake?" "I am now." She ignored the joke. That alone told him everything. The news mattered. Walter sat upright. His bedroom remained dark except for the faint glow from the digital clock. Rebecca took a breath, then spoke carefully. The examiner finished. Walter waited. The signature wasn't produced naturally. A long silence followed, not because Walter was shocked, because hearing confirmation felt different than suspecting it. Rebecca continued, "There are indications of tracing." Walter closed his eyes briefly. "The signature is fake." "According to the preliminary findings..." Another pause. "Yes." The room became very quiet. Outside, wind pushed against the windows. Inside, Walter listened. Not to Rebecca, to his own thoughts. A forgery changed everything. It transformed a difficult divorce into something much larger, something far more serious. Rebecca wasn't finished. "There's one more thing." Walter opened his eyes. "What?" The hesitation in her voice was new and troubling, because Rebecca Hayes rarely hesitated. "The examiner found something attached to the file metadata." Walter frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means the document may not be the only problem." Walter felt his stomach tighten slightly, for the first time in weeks. "What else did they find?" Rebecca took another breath, then delivered the sentence that would alter the entire direction of the case. "The forged signature wasn't created alone." She paused. "There are signs that additional supporting documents may have been manufactured at the same time." The rumors began spreading long before the court dates did. That told Walter something important. Someone wasn't merely preparing a legal case. Someone was preparing an audience. 2 days after Rebecca informed him about the forged signature findings, Walter walked into a coffee shop near Civic Center Park and immediately noticed the change. 3 people he knew were sitting near the window, people he had spoken with for years. One offered a polite nod. Another looked away. The third suddenly became very interested in her laptop screen. Nobody was openly hostile. That wasn't how social campaigns worked. Distance was more effective than confrontation. Distance created assumptions. Assumptions created narratives. And narratives spread themselves. Walter ordered his coffee, sat alone, watched snow drift past the windows, then listened, not intentionally, simply because the conversation at the next table wasn't quiet. Lauren finally did it. I heard. Honestly, good for her. She carried that marriage forever. Walter continued stirring his coffee, slowly, calmly. The speakers never realized he was sitting 10 feet away, or perhaps they did. Either way, the message reached him. Lauren's version of events was already circulating. The successful entrepreneur, the underachieving husband, the woman who had finally chosen herself. It was a clean story, simple, easy to repeat. Most importantly, it matched what people already believed. Walter finished his coffee and left without saying a word. Because correcting rumors rarely worked, evidence worked, rumors did not. 3 days later, another example appeared, this time at work. A deputy named Frank entered Walter's office carrying maintenance reports. Normally, Frank spoke for 10 minutes about football. This time he seemed uncomfortable, distracted. Eventually he cleared his throat. "Everything okay?" Walter looked up. "Sure." Frank nodded, then hesitated. "I saw something online." There it was. Walter waited. Frank shifted awkwardly. "A business blog." "What kind of business blog?" "Denver Growth Review." Walter recognized the publication immediately. Local, popular among developers and investors. Lauren had been featured there multiple times. After Frank left, Walter searched for the article. It appeared near the top of the homepage. The headline wasn't about divorce, not directly. It was framed as a business profile, a spotlight piece, a success story. Lauren Kelly, Building the Future Through Resilience. Walter read every word. The article never mentioned him by name. It didn't need to. The message was obvious. Lauren had endured years of personal challenges while growing her company. Lauren had remained focused despite a difficult home life. Lauren had sacrificed personal happiness for professional success. The wording was careful, legally safe, socially effective. Anyone reading it would reach the same conclusion. Lauren was a victim. Walter was the obstacle. He closed the article, then opened a notebook, and wrote down the publication date. Nothing more, no emotional reaction, just documentation. Rebecca had advised him to document everything, so he did. Over the following weeks, the pattern intensified. Mutual friends became less available. Phone calls slowed. Invitations disappeared. One couple canceled dinner plans 3 separate times. Another stopped responding altogether. Walter noticed. But he didn't chase anyone. People showed their character during uncertainty. No need to interrupt the process. Meanwhile, Lauren's public appearances increased. More interviews, more events, more photographs. Grant Sullivan appeared beside her more frequently as well. Not enough to attract immediate attention. Enough for Walter to notice, especially after learning what he now knew. One Thursday evening, Walter attended a community development meeting because one of his warehouse tenants was presenting expansion plans. The meeting was held in a renovated industrial building near Reno. About 70 people attended. Investors, developers, city representatives, business owners. Walter sat quietly near the back. Halfway through the evening, Lauren entered. Grant walked beside her. Neither expected Walter to be there. The brief surprise on Lauren's face disappeared almost instantly. Years of public appearances had taught her how to control expressions. Still, Walter saw it. The moment lasted less than a second. But it was there. Lauren approached. "Didn't know you'd be here." Walter nodded. "My tenant is presenting." Grant smiled, confident as always. "Small world?" Walter looked at him. "Denver's not that big." Grant laughed. Lauren didn't. The conversation lasted less than a minute before they moved on. Walter watched them cross the room together. Again he noticed the familiarity, the rhythm, the comfort, the private understanding. Still no proof of anything, only observations. Observations he carefully stored away. The real developments were happening elsewhere. Inside law offices, inside financial records, inside court filings. Every week, Rebecca uncovered something new. Nothing explosive, not yet, but enough to strengthen concerns. Several financial disclosures submitted by Lauren's side contained inconsistencies. Dates didn't align perfectly. Property descriptions shifted slightly between filings. Ownership references appeared unusually vague. Each issue by itself seemed minor. Together, they created a pattern. Rebecca noticed it too. One Friday afternoon, she called Walter into her office. Stacks of documents covered nearly every surface. Highlighters, notes, property records, bank statements, trust filings. The investigation had become larger than either of them originally expected. Rebecca pointed toward a specific timeline she had assembled. "Look at this." Walter studied the chart. It tracked legal activity, property inquiries, business partnerships, and divorce preparation milestones. The overlap was remarkable. Certain trust-related inquiries occurred months before the divorce filing. Several corresponded with projects involving Grant Sullivan. Others aligned with Lauren's growing involvement in specific commercial developments. Rebecca tapped the page. They started researching these assets long before the marriage officially ended. Walter remained silent, because he had already reached the same conclusion. Rebecca continued. "The question isn't whether someone was looking. The question is why." Walter looked at the dates again. Every line seemed to point toward the same destination. Money, property, control. Not heartbreak, not reconciliation, not emotional conflict. Strategy. Carefully planned strategy. The following Monday brought another surprise. Lauren's attorneys filed a formal request. They wanted the upcoming hearing open to broader observation. Not technically public in the sense of television cameras, but open enough that interested parties could attend. Business associates, observers, media representatives, anyone with sufficient justification. Rebecca read the motion twice, then laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was revealing. "They want an audience." Walter sat across from her desk. "Looks that way." Rebecca leaned back. "They think public pressure helps them." Walter wasn't surprised. Public perception currently favored Lauren. A visible hearing increased that advantage, or at least they believed it would. Rebecca stared at the motion, then slowly smiled. The expression reminded Walter of a chess player spotting something. Not a victory, an opportunity. "They're getting comfortable." Walter understood immediately. Comfortable people made mistakes. Overconfident people made bigger mistakes. The motion was approved later that week. The hearing would proceed with observers present. Exactly what Lauren wanted. Exactly what Cynthia Prescott wanted. Exactly what Ethan Brooks wanted. A room full of witnesses. A room full of assumptions. A room full of people expecting Walter Kelly to lose. That evening, Walter drove home beneath a dark Colorado sky. Traffic moved slowly along Interstate 25. The city lights shimmered in the distance. For a brief moment, he thought about how different everything looked compared to 6 months earlier. Back then, he believed he was watching a marriage fall apart. Now he understood he was watching something else entirely. A campaign. A coordinated effort to define reality before facts could. The irony was almost amusing. Because while Lauren was building a narrative, Walter was building a file filled with records, dates, transactions, signatures, reports, evidence. Stories depended on belief, evidence depended on proof, and one of those things lasted longer. As he pulled into his driveway, his phone vibrated. A text message from Rebecca. Only one sentence. The forensic team found another discrepancy. "Call me tomorrow." Walter read the message twice, then looked toward the dark house. Another discrepancy, another piece of the puzzle. And somewhere inside those growing files, the mistake that would eventually unravel everything was becoming impossible to hide. The emergency motion arrived at 4:46 p.m. on a Wednesday. Rebecca Hayes called Walter less than 10 minutes later. Her voice was calm, too calm. Walter had learned that Rebecca became quieter when something serious appeared. "What happened?" he asked. "Ethan Brooks happened." Walter was sitting in his truck outside the courthouse parking garage. The workday had just ended. Snow clouds were gathering over Denver again. "What did he file?" Rebecca exhaled slowly. "An emergency motion alleging concealed marital assets." Walter wasn't surprised. The timing made sense. Lauren's side had spent weeks shaping public perception. The next step was obvious. Create urgency, create suspicion, force a reaction. Walter started the truck. And he made a mistake. That got Walter's attention. Rebecca wasn't someone who casually described opposing counsel as making mistakes. "What kind of mistake?" "The kind lawyers regret." 30 minutes later, Walter sat across from her office desk, reviewing the filing. The document was aggressive, even by divorce litigation standards. Ethan Brooks argued that Walter had intentionally hidden substantial assets from Lauren throughout the marriage. He claimed Walter failed to disclose relevant ownership interests. He requested expedited court intervention, additional financial disclosures, potential sanctions, and immediate review of specific trust-related assets. The motion read like an attack, sharp, confident, designed to place Walter on the defensive. But Rebecca wasn't focused on the accusations. She was focused on one attachment, the same attachment that immediately caught Walter's eye, the forged trust document, again. The same false signature, the same fraudulent notarization, the same fabricated amendment. This time officially attached to an emergency motion submitted directly to the court. Walter looked up. Rebecca was already watching him. "You see it?" He nodded. "They filed it. They filed it." The room became quiet, because both of them understood the significance. A forged document sitting inside private negotiations was dangerous. A forged document formally submitted to a judge was something else entirely. It transformed the issue. Now there was a court record, a timestamp, a filing trail, an official chain of custody. Rebecca leaned back. "They've authenticated our evidence for us." Walter understood immediately. Before this moment, Lauren's attorneys could potentially argue confusion. Draft versions, misunderstandings, clerical mistakes. Now those arguments became much harder. The document had been selected, attached, submitted, relied upon, deliberately. Rebecca tapped the filing. "This may be the most useful thing Ethan Brooks has done for us." Walter almost smiled. Almost. "Do you think he knows?" "No." "What makes you sure?" Rebecca folded her arms. "Because nobody knowingly files evidence that can destroy their own argument." That answer felt right. Ethan Brooks was aggressive, not stupid. The distinction mattered. The following week became a blur of preparation. Rebecca's office expanded its review. The forensic examiner completed additional analysis. Digital metadata was examined. Document creation histories were compared. Supporting materials were verified. Every answer produced more questions, and every question seemed to lead toward the same conclusion. The forged amendment had not been created alone. It belonged to a package, a collection of supporting materials designed to tell a specific story, a story that happened to benefit Lauren's claims. One afternoon, Rebecca introduced Walter to a forensic accountant named Martin Keegan. Martin was 63, thin, precise, the kind of man who treated spreadsheets like crime scenes. Walter liked him immediately. Martin spent 2 hours reviewing financial records, then requested additional bank statements. 3 days later, he called. "I need to show you something." Walter met him at a conference room in Lakewood. Martin projected transaction records onto a large screen. Rows of numbers filled the display. Transfers, deposits, corporate accounts, property-related expenses. Most people would have seen meaningless data. Walter paid attention. Martin pointed toward several transactions. "Do you recognize these?" Walter studied them. "No, you shouldn't." Martin zoomed in. "The accounts belong to entities connected to Sullivan Development Partners." Grant Sullivan, again. Walter wasn't surprised anymore. Grant's name appeared too frequently to ignore. Martin continued. "Now watch this." Another screen appeared, this time showing property-related consulting payments. The amounts weren't enormous. $5,000, $8,000, $12,000, individually insignificant, collectively interesting, especially because the consulting activity coincided with trust-related property inquiries. Martin adjusted his glasses. "I can't tell you what it means." Walter appreciated the honesty. But I can tell you the timing is unusual." Walter nodded. That was enough. Facts first, interpretations later. Rebecca felt the same way. Over the next several days, she focused on building something stronger than accusations. A timeline. Timelines didn't argue. Timelines simply existed. Dates, events, filings, financial activity, document creation, trust inquiries, property reviews. The more complete the timeline became, the more uncomfortable the pattern looked. Not necessarily criminal, not yet, but certainly deliberate. Meanwhile, Lauren continued her public campaign. Another interview appeared online. Another business profile, another photograph, another carefully constructed image. Walter occasionally saw them. mostly because co-workers forwarded links. Nobody intended harm. People were curious. Curiosity always grows around divorce. Walter ignored most of it. What interested him wasn't what Lauren was saying publicly. What interested him was what her legal team was doing privately. That was where mistakes lived. 2 weeks before the hearing, Martin Keegan called again. This time his tone sounded different, more focused. "I found something." Walter drove to Rebecca's office immediately. Martin already had documents spread across the conference table: bank records, wire transfers, audit reports, compliance notes. Rebecca looked unusually satisfied, a dangerous expression on a lawyer. Martin pointed toward a specific report. "This came from a compliance review." Walter studied the paperwork. The report concerned a financial institution that handled several commercial transactions. One section had been highlighted. Martin tapped it. "Read that paragraph." Walter did. Twice. Then a third time. The language was technical, dry, easy to overlook. Yet the implication was significant. Several trust-related ownership inquiries had originated from parties lacking proper authorization. Not illegal inquiries, but unusual, repeated, persistent, the kind compliance departments notice. Walter looked up. "Who made them?" Martin shook his head. "The report doesn't identify individuals." Rebecca stepped in. "But it identifies timing." Walter understood immediately. Timing mattered. Because timing connected people to events. And these inquiries occurred during the exact period Lauren's divorce preparation intensified. Again, another coincidence becoming harder to dismiss. Rebecca gathered the papers. "Martin's final audit packet should be ready next week." Walter nodded. The audit had become one of the most important pieces of the case, not because it proved fraud, because it established context. Context explained behavior. Behavior explained motive, and motive often revealed intent. As the hearing approached, pressure increased. Settlement proposals arrived almost weekly, some aggressive, some seemingly reasonable. Each carried the same underlying message: sign now, end this quietly, move on. Walter refused everyone, not because he wanted revenge, because facts remained unresolved, and unresolved facts had a habit of becoming expensive later. One evening, nearly 10 days before the hearing, Walter returned home to find a courier envelope waiting near the front door. Inside was another settlement proposal. The terms were slightly improved, less aggressive than before, still unreasonable, still based on assumptions Lauren's team had not proven. Walter read it once, then filed it away. The next morning, Rebecca called. "The audit is finished." Walter stopped what he was doing. For the first time in weeks, excitement touched Rebecca's voice. Not emotional excitement, professional excitement, the dangerous kind. "What did Martin find?" Rebecca paused, long enough for Walter to understand the answer mattered. Then she spoke. "He found what we've been missing." Walter waited. "The bridge." "What bridge?" Rebecca smiled. "The connection between the trust inquiries, the property claims, and the timeline." Walter felt something shift, a subtle change, like the final pieces of a puzzle sliding into place. "How strong is it?" Rebecca's answer came immediately. "Strong enough that I want certified copies." Strong enough. Those two words stayed with Walter all day. Strong enough meant useful. Strong enough meant admissible. Strong enough meant real. 3 days later, the completed audit package arrived. Sealed, certified, documented. More than 100 pages. Martin personally delivered it. Walter held the package for several seconds before opening it. The weight surprised him. Not physically, emotionally. Months of investigation, months of rumors, months of assumptions, now condensed into a single collection of facts. Rebecca looked at the sealed packet, then at Walter. "Keep it safe." Walter nodded. He already knew where it would go. Inside the same leather briefcase carrying the trust records, the same briefcase he planned to bring into court. Because for the first time since Lauren filed for divorce, Walter possessed something more powerful than suspicion. He possessed evidence. And somewhere inside that audit packet sat the information that would eventually force an entire courtroom to stop talking and start listening. The night before the hearing arrived quietly. No dramatic confrontation, No last-minute threats. No scenes in parking lots or courthouse hallways. Just silence. The kind of silence that appears when two people have already traveled too far in opposite directions to find their way back. Walter left work at 4:11 p.m. A cold wind swept through downtown Denver as he walked toward his truck. The courthouse behind him glowed under the fading winter sunlight. For 14 years, those stone walls had represented stability, routine, order. Tomorrow he would be sitting on the other side of that system, not as an employee, as a man defending his name. The thought didn't frighten him. It simply felt strange. He drove home through rush-hour traffic. The radio remained off. The city passed by outside his windshield. Restaurants, gas stations, apartment buildings. Ordinary people living ordinary lives. None of them knew what tomorrow would bring. Walter almost envied them. Almost. When he reached the house, it was empty. Lauren had moved most of her belongings weeks earlier. Only traces remained. A few decorative items, kitchen equipment, several framed photographs still hanging on walls. Neither of them seemed interested in claiming. The house felt like a hotel room after checkout, occupied, but abandoned. Walter placed his briefcase on their dining room table, then disappeared into his study. The room had become command central over the past several months. Every important document sat organized inside labeled folders. Every note, every timeline, every record. Rebecca liked organization. Walter liked certainty. The two habits worked well together. He opened the safe hidden behind a bookshelf. Inside sat the documents that mattered most: Mercer Commercial Trust records, certified ownership filings, property registrations, forensic findings, notary verification reports, the audit packet Martin Keegan had delivered, and one cream-colored envelope. The envelope looked ordinary, unremarkable. Something a person might use for tax records or insurance paperwork. Nothing about it suggested significance, which was exactly why Walter appreciated it. Important things rarely announced themselves. He placed the envelope on the desk, then carefully reviewed its contents. Again. Not because he doubted them, because repetition created confidence. The certified trust amendment sat on top. Beneath it rested supporting documentation, ownership histories, creation dates, registration records, verification statements, everything tied together, everything consistent, everything traceable. Unlike the documents Lauren's side had submitted, that difference mattered. Facts liked consistency. Fabrications struggled with it. For nearly 2 hours, Walter reviewed every page. The process calmed him. Each document reminded him why he had remained patient, why he hadn't reacted publicly, why he hadn't responded to rumors, why he hadn't confronted Lauren. Evidence required discipline. Emotion often destroyed discipline. Around 7 o'clock, his phone vibrated. A text message. Lauren, the first direct message she had sent in nearly 2 weeks. Walter stared at the screen before opening it. The message contained only 3 sentences. Tomorrow doesn't have to be ugly. There's still time to settle. Think carefully tonight. Walter read the words twice, then set the phone down. No reply. Not because he wanted to appear strong, because there was nothing left to discuss. The time for conversations had ended months ago. Tomorrow would be about documents, not opinions. 10 minutes later, another message arrived, this one from Rebecca. Everything ready? Walter replied immediately. Yes. Her answer appeared moments later. Good. Sleep. We're not chasing them tomorrow. They're walking into us. Walter smiled slightly. That sounded exactly like Rebecca. Practical, precise, confident. He placed the phone aside, then returned to the files. By 9 o'clock, the house had grown completely quiet. Outside, snow began falling again. Large flakes drifted past the windows. The weather forecast predicted accumulation overnight. Walter made coffee despite the late hour. Not because he needed caffeine, because rituals mattered. He carried the mug into the living room, sat in his father's old leather chair, and allowed his thoughts to wander. Not toward Lauren, not toward Grant Sullivan, not toward Cynthia Prescott or Ethan Brooks, toward his father, Frank Kelly, the man who taught him patience, the man who taught him to buy assets nobody else wanted. The man who believed documentation was a form of protection. Years earlier, when Walter helped manage the first warehouse acquisition, Frank had offered simple advice. Most people lose because they react before they think. At the time, Walter thought it sounded obvious. Now he understood its value. People became emotional, angry, proud, impatient. Those emotions created mistakes. Mistakes created opportunities. Lauren's side had spent months reacting to assumptions. Walter had spent months preparing. The difference was beginning to matter. Near 10 o'clock he stood and walked toward a hallway closet. Inside sat several old storage boxes. One contained family photographs. Another held legal records from years earlier. A third contained personal items belonging to his father. Walter opened the third box. Inside rested an old wristwatch. Simple, silver, nothing expensive. The watch had stopped working years ago. Walter never repaired it. He didn't need it to function. Its value wasn't mechanical. It was symbolic, a reminder of where everything began. The warehouses, the trust, the years of work, the sacrifices nobody saw. He carried the watch back to the study, placed it beside the cream-colored envelope, then sat quietly for several minutes. The image felt appropriate somehow. The past beside the future, the foundation beside the proof. Eventually, he turned off the office light, prepared for bed, and almost succeeded in falling asleep. Almost. At 11:42 p.m. his phone rang. Walter immediately recognized the number. Rebecca, again. He answered. "Everything okay?" "Yes." Her tone sounded calm, different from the midnight call weeks earlier. This wasn't an emergency. "What happened?" "I wanted to tell you something before tomorrow." Walter listened. Rebecca continued. "Cynthia Prescott called." That got his attention. "What did she want?" "A settlement discussion." Walter wasn't surprised, not entirely. Pressure often increased before hearings, especially when uncertainty appeared. "What did you tell her?" Rebecca laughed softly. "The truth." And she sounded nervous. Walter sat up slightly. Rebecca rarely offered observations without reason. "Cynthia Prescott doesn't get nervous often." "No." "So if she's nervous now—" Walter finished the thought silently. Something had changed. Perhaps not everything, but something. Rebecca continued. "They know we have more than they expected." Walter considered that. It fit. The audit, the forensic findings, the filing errors, the inconsistencies. Enough information had surfaced to create concern. Not panic, concern. Concern was often the first crack. "What happens tomorrow?" Walter asked. Rebecca answered immediately. "We stay calm." That part sounded easy. "We let them talk." Also easy. "And then," Rebecca paused, a long pause. Then she said the sentence Walter would remember years later. "Then we give the judge one reason to stop listening to stories." Walter looked toward the cream-colored envelope resting on the desk. One reason, one document, one fact. Sometimes that was all it took. After the call ended, he finally went to bed. Sleep came slowly. Not because of fear. Because tomorrow represented a dividing line. Everything before tomorrow belonged to preparation. Everything after tomorrow would belong to consequences. Outside, snow continued falling across Denver. Inside, the house remained silent. The envelope rested untouched on the study desk. The same envelope Lauren would never notice. The same envelope Cynthia Prescott would underestimate. The same envelope Ethan Brooks would dismiss. And less than 12 hours later, inside a crowded courtroom filled with observers expecting Walter Kelly to defend himself, that envelope would become the most important object in the room. Walter arrived at the Denver County Family Court 43 minutes early. That wasn't unusual. He had spent 14 years arriving early for work. Habit rarely disappeared simply because circumstances changed. Snow covered portions of the courthouse steps. Maintenance crews had already cleared most walkways. The winter sky hung low over downtown Denver. Gray, cold, quiet. Walter parked in a public lot 3 blocks away and walked the remaining distance carrying his leather briefcase. Inside sat the cream-colored envelope. Nothing else in the briefcase mattered nearly as much. As he approached the courthouse entrance, he noticed something immediately. More people than expected, much more. Observers stood near the security checkpoint. Several local business reporters waited in the lobby. A few familiar faces from Denver's commercial real estate community lingered near the elevators. Lauren had gotten her audience, exactly as planned. Walter wasn't surprised. Public victories were more satisfying when people watched. At least that was the theory. Security procedures delayed everyone slightly. Metal detectors, identification checks, routine courthouse business. Walter passed through quickly. Several deputies recognized him. A few offered discreet nods. Nobody discussed the hearing. Professional courtesy. He appreciated that. At 8:14 a.m., Walter entered the hallway outside courtroom 4B. The room wouldn't open for another 15 minutes. Already people had gathered. Lawyers, observers, curious spectators. Some pretended not to recognize him. Others looked directly at him. Walter ignored all of it. He found a bench, sat down, waited. The hallway noise rose and fell around him. Conversations, footsteps, phones vibrating, court personnel moving between rooms, normal sounds, normal courthouse rhythms, rhythms Walter knew better than most. At 8:21 a.m., Rebecca Hayes arrived. Dark blue suit, briefcase, focused expression. She carried herself exactly as she always did. No drama, no performance. She sat beside Walter. "How'd you sleep?" "A few hours." Rebecca nodded. "Good enough." Walter smiled slightly. That qualified as optimism from Rebecca. She opened her briefcase, reviewed several documents, then looked toward the far end of the hallway. Walter followed her gaze. Lauren had arrived. The entrance felt almost theatrical, not intentionally, perhaps, but effectively. Lauren wore a tailored cream-colored coat over a dark designer dress. Her posture radiated confidence. Cynthia Prescott walked beside her. Ethan Brooks followed, carrying multiple binders. Grant Sullivan wasn't present. Walter noticed immediately. He found that interesting. Several observers greeted Lauren. Some shook her hand. Others offered supportive smiles. Lauren accepted each interaction comfortably, as though she were attending a business conference rather than a divorce hearing. Walter watched quietly, not because he cared about appearances, because observation remained useful. Lauren never looked toward him, not once. She acknowledged Rebecca briefly, ignored Walter completely. The choice appeared deliberate. Another message, another performance. Rebecca noticed too. "Still playing to the room?" Walter shrugged. "Seems that way." At 8:32 a.m., court staff opened the courtroom doors. The crowd began filing inside. The room wasn't enormous, but it was large enough to accommodate observers. Wood-paneled walls, rows of benches, a raised judicial bench at the front. Walter had entered hundreds of courtrooms during his career. Today felt different, because today he wasn't fixing a light fixture, he wasn't checking a heating unit, he wasn't replacing wiring. He was one of the reasons the room existed. The realization felt strange. The observers settled into their seats. Reporters opened notebooks. Attorneys arranged files. Court staff prepared the docket. Walter sat beside Rebecca at the respondents' table. Lauren sat across from him, approximately 12 feet away. 12 feet, after 11 years of marriage. The distance seemed symbolic somehow. Close enough to see every expression. Far enough to feel like strangers. Judge Eleanor Whitaker entered promptly at 9 o'clock. Everyone stood. The room settled. Formalities concluded. The hearing began. Walter had seen Judge Whitaker before, not personally, professionally. She possessed a reputation for patience and very little tolerance for nonsense. A useful combination. Cynthia Prescott rose first, exactly as expected. The opening presentation was polished, professional, confident. She spoke clearly, moved smoothly between exhibits, maintained constant eye contact with the judge. Years of experience showed in every sentence. Walter listened carefully, not because he feared her argument, because understanding an opponent mattered. Cynthia's strategy became obvious within minutes. Frame Lauren as the responsible partner, frame Walter as secretive, frame the disputed assets as hidden, frame urgency as necessary. Simple, direct, effective. Several observers nodded occasionally. The narrative matched what they already believed. That helped. People preferred information confirming existing assumptions. Walter knew that. Cynthia knew it too. Then Ethan Brooks took over. The shift was immediate. Where Cynthia was polished, Ethan was aggressive. He attacked. Not emotionally, strategically. Every statement implied concealment. Every argument implied deception. Every exhibit implied Walter had spent years hiding information from his wife. Walter remained motionless. The accusations didn't surprise him. Neither did the confidence. Ethan believed his own case, that much was obvious. He referenced the trust amendment repeatedly, the forged amendment, again and again and again. Each reference strengthened their position, or so he believed. Rebecca never interrupted. That seemed to confuse several observers. She took notes, nothing more. No objections, no dramatic reactions, no visible resistance. Walter understood why. Rebecca wanted them comfortable. Comfortable people kept talking. Ethan continued for nearly 40 minutes. When he finally sat down, the atmosphere inside the courtroom felt settled, predictable. The audience had heard one side of the story, and that side sounded convincing. Lauren appeared relaxed, confident, almost relieved. The public hearing she wanted was unfolding exactly as planned, at least so far. Judge Whitaker reviewed her notes, then looked toward Rebecca. "Miss Hayes?" The room became quieter. Observers shifted slightly. Pens paused. Expectations focused toward Walter's table. Rebecca rose slowly. No rush, no visible concern. She adjusted a folder, closed a binder, then stepped toward the lectern. Walter recognized the look on her face. The same expression she wore when reviewing evidence. The same expression she wore when she knew something others didn't. "Your Honor," she began. Her voice carried clearly through the room. "We appreciate opposing counsel's presentation. An unusual opening." Several people glanced at each other. Even Ethan Brooks looked mildly surprised. Rebecca continued. "The petitioner has spoken extensively about hidden assets." A brief pause. "And extensively about documentation." Another pause. Judge Whitaker watched carefully. "So before addressing any conclusions," Rebecca placed one hand on the lectern, "I believe we should address the reliability of certain documents currently before this court." For the first time that morning, Walter saw Ethan Brooks shift in his seat. Only slightly. But enough. Rebecca hadn't challenged the narrative. Not yet. She had challenged the foundation, a very different approach. Judge Whitaker nodded. "Proceed." Rebecca opened a file. Not the envelope. Not yet. A smaller file. The first step. The setup. The room remained completely silent. No one seemed to realize what was happening. Not the observers, not the reporters, possibly not even Lauren, because everyone expected Rebecca to defend Walter. Instead, she was preparing to examine the evidence itself, and evidence was far less emotional than stories, far less forgiving too. Rebecca spoke calmly, measured, precise. "Your Honor, before discussing property interests, we need to discuss a trust amendment repeatedly, referenced by opposing counsel." Across the room, Ethan Brooks sat a little straighter. Cynthia Prescott's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Walter noticed. Years of observation had trained him to notice small things. Small things often mattered most. Judge Whitaker nodded again. "Go ahead." Rebecca reached into her folder, then paused, only for a second, just long enough for the room's attention to tighten. Walter knew what came next. Not the envelope, not yet, but the first crack, the first thread, the first indication that the story everyone had been hearing for months might not survive contact with evidence. And for the first time all morning, Cynthia Prescott looked uncertain. Rebecca Hayes did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. The quietest person in a courtroom often controlled it. "Your Honor," she said, "the petitioner has relied heavily upon a trust amendment allegedly executed by my client approximately 18 months ago." Judge Whitaker glanced down at the court file. "I've reviewed the document." "Yes, Your Honor." Rebecca paused, then continued. "We have as well." A few people shifted in their seats, nothing dramatic, just subtle movement, the kind produced when attention begins focusing. Walter sat motionless. His hands rested calmly on the table. The cream-colored envelope remained inside his briefcase. Not yet. Rebecca wasn't ready. First, she needed the room to understand what they were looking at. Then she would show them why it mattered. She lifted a document. Before discussing property ownership, I'd like the court to examine the foundation upon which those ownership claims are based. Judge Whitaker nodded. Proceed. Rebecca handed copies to the bailiff. The documents moved through the courtroom. One copy to the judge. Additional copies to Cynthia Prescott and Ethan Brooks. Walter watched Ethan accept the paperwork. At first, the attorney appeared relaxed, confident. Then he began reading. And the confidence weakened, not dramatically, just enough. Rebecca continued speaking. This document contains findings from a certified forensic handwriting examiner. The courtroom became noticeably quieter. Walter noticed a reporter pick up his pen. Another opened a notebook. Judge Whitaker reviewed the first page. Her expression remained unreadable. Rebecca allowed several seconds to pass. Then she delivered the next sentence. The examiner concluded the signature attributed to Walter Kelly was not naturally executed by Walter Kelly. No reaction exploded through the room. Real courtrooms rarely worked that way. Instead, silence deepened, the kind of silence created when people begin recalculating assumptions. Judge Whitaker looked up. You're alleging forgery? No, Your Honor. Rebecca shook her head slightly. The examiner is. That distinction mattered, very much. The judge returned to the report. Across the room, Cynthia Prescott had stopped writing notes. Ethan Brooks continued reading, fast, too fast. Walter noticed. People read quickly when searching for weaknesses, not when enjoying surprises. Rebecca wasn't finished. The examiner identified multiple inconsistencies. She referenced specific findings. Pen pressure variations. Stroke sequencing issues. Evidence of tracing. Signature construction anomalies. Technical language. Not exciting, not emotional. Exactly what made it powerful. Facts didn't need excitement. Facts needed credibility. Judge Whitaker spent nearly a full minute reviewing the report. Then she turned toward Ethan Brooks. Mr. Brooks. The attorney immediately stood. Your Honor, did you independently verify this signature before relying upon it? The question landed harder than it sounded. Walter recognized that instantly. Judges often revealed concern through wording. Judge Whitaker hadn't asked whether Ethan believed the document. She had asked whether he verified it. Very different question. Ethan cleared his throat. The document was provided as part of disclosure materials available to the petitioner. Not an answer, Judge Whitaker noticed. So the answer is no. A pause. Then, we relied upon representations made during discovery. Still not an answer. Walter watched the judge write something in her notes. Only a few words. But she wrote them carefully. That mattered. Rebecca stepped forward again. Your Honor, that's only part of the issue. The room became still, because everyone sensed another layer approaching. And they were right. Rebecca produced another document, then another, then another. The sequence was deliberate, not overwhelming. Organized, methodical, exactly the way Walter preferred things. This is a certified response from the notary office identified on the amendment. Copies moved again. Judge Whitaker examined them immediately. Walter saw Cynthia Prescott's posture change, a small adjustment, a subtle tightening, nothing obvious, unless someone had spent years observing witnesses and attorneys. Walter had. Rebecca continued. The notarization record associated with the disputed amendment does not exist. Nobody spoke, not even Ethan. Rebecca allowed the statement to settle, then clarified. The office maintains no log entry showing Mr. Kelly's appearance. Another pause. No identification record. Another pause. No appointment. Another. No verification. Judge Whitaker slowly lowered the papers. For the first time all morning, visible concern appeared on her face. Not anger. Concern. The distinction mattered. Anger was emotional. Concern was procedural. Concern created consequences. Walter noticed one of the reporters glance toward Lauren. The reporter expected some reaction. There wasn't one, at least not externally. Lauren sat perfectly still. The same controlled posture she had maintained all morning. The narrator could not know what she was thinking, only what Walter observed. And Walter observed something simple. Her confidence was no longer growing. It was holding on, barely. Rebecca moved to the next issue. The court should also be aware that this same disputed document appears repeatedly throughout the petitioner's filings. Judge Whittaker nodded. I've noticed. Which creates a significant reliability concern. Walter saw Ethan begin taking notes rapidly, much faster than before. That interested him, because preparation usually happened before hearings, not during them. Rebecca turned another page, then another. The room listened. The audience that had arrived expecting a public defeat was now witnessing something else, something less dramatic, far more dangerous. A narrative collapsing beneath documentation. One piece at a time, Judge Whittaker finally looked toward Cynthia Prescott. Miss Prescott. Cynthia stood immediately. Professional, controlled, experienced. Your Honor, when did your office first become aware of this forensic challenge? A careful question. A very careful question. Cynthia answered just as carefully. We received notice from opposing counsel recently. Did you conduct any independent review? A slight hesitation. Tiny. Most people missed it. Walter didn't. We were evaluating the issue. Again, not quite an answer. Judge Whittaker wrote another note. The courtroom remained silent. Then Rebecca did something unexpected. She sat down. Nothing more. No dramatic speech. No celebration. No emotional argument. Just sat down. Walter understood why. Because she wasn't trying to win an argument. She was creating space. Space allowed people to think, and thinking often favored facts. Several seconds passed. Judge Whittaker reviewed documents quietly. Observers waited. Reporters waited. Even court staff seemed unusually attentive. Then the judge spoke. Mr. Kelly. Walter looked up. Yes, Your Honor. The judge studied him briefly. Do you dispute signing this amendment? No, Your Honor. A few observers appeared confused. The wording sounded strange. Judge Whittaker noticed immediately. Clarify. Walter nodded. I do not dispute it. The room became even quieter. Ethan Brooks looked relieved for half a second. Then Walter continued. I deny signing it. The relief disappeared. Walter's voice remained calm, steady, measured. The same tone he used discussing maintenance schedules. No performance, no outrage, just a statement. The judge nodded. Understood. Then she returned to the documents. Another long silence followed. Walter knew exactly what Rebecca was doing. She was building pressure, not through confrontation, through accumulation. Each piece alone created concern. Together they created a pattern, and patterns were difficult to ignore, especially for judges. Finally, Rebecca rose once more. Now came the moment, the real moment. Not the forensic report, not the notary issue, not the signature challenge. Those were introductions, necessary, important, but not central. Walter felt his briefcase beneath the table. The cream-colored envelope remained inside. The same envelope from the hook. The same envelope he had protected for months. The same envelope containing the document Rebecca deliberately withheld until now. She looked toward him, only briefly. Walter understood immediately. The time had arrived. Without speaking, he opened the briefcase, removed the envelope, and handed it to her. The movement seemed ordinary, almost insignificant. A simple transfer of paperwork. Most observers barely noticed, but Judge Whittaker did. Experienced judges noticed everything. Rebecca accepted the envelope, then approached the clerk. Your Honor. Her voice remained calm, professional, controlled. We would like to submit one additional certified document. Judge Whittaker extended her hand. The clerk delivered the envelope. The judge opened it, removed the contents, and began reading. The change happened gradually. A slight narrowing of the eyes. A second reading, then a third. No one spoke. No one moved. Even Ethan Brooks stopped taking notes. Walter watched the judge continue reading. Line after line, page after page. The document wasn't lengthy, but it was devastating. Because unlike every disputed filing presented so far, this one came directly from the original trust record. Certified, authenticated, traceable, unambiguous. Judge Whittaker reached the final page, then looked up, slowly, very slowly. Her gaze settled first on Rebecca, then Walter. then across the room toward Cynthia Prescott and Ethan Brooks. The courtroom remained completely silent. Finally, the judge spoke, and the first sentence out of her mouth changed the direction of the entire hearing. "Counsel," she paused, holding the certified document in her hand. "Why was this trust record not disclosed to the court earlier?" The question hung over the courtroom like a weight. Judge Whittaker did not repeat it. She didn't need to. Everyone had heard it clearly. Why was this trust record not disclosed to the court earlier? Silence followed. Not dramatic silence, not television silence. The real kind. The kind that appears when experienced professionals suddenly realize something important may have been missed. Walter sat quietly beside Rebecca Hayes. Across the room, Cynthia Prescott remained standing. For the first time all morning she appeared to be searching for words. Not panicking, not collapsing, simply recalculating. Judge Whittaker waited. Patience was one of the reasons attorneys respected her. Eventually Cynthia answered. "Your Honor, we were relying on the documentation available to us." The judge nodded slightly. A neutral gesture, nothing more. Then she lifted the certified trust record again. The document had been created years before Walter and Lauren married. It established Mercer Commercial Trust. It identified the original assets. It outlined ownership rights. Most importantly, it included a certified amendment history showing no transfer of ownership into marital property, no ambiguity, no uncertainty, no hidden language. The record was remarkably straightforward, which made the situation worse, not better. Judge Whittaker turned several pages, then looked toward Rebecca. "These records are certified." "Yes, Your Honor." "The source," Rebecca answered immediately. "The original trust registry and supporting county records." The judge nodded, then turned toward the court clerk. "Please verify the certification numbers." The clerk accepted the documents. Several observers exchanged glances. Reporters wrote furiously. Walter noticed everything, not because he enjoyed it, because observation had become habit. Years spent inside courtrooms created certain instincts. One of those instincts involved recognizing momentum. Momentum had changed, not completely, but noticeably. For the first 3 hours of the hearing, Lauren's side controlled the narrative. Now the narrative was controlling them. The difference mattered. The clerk spent several minutes reviewing the certifications. The room remained quiet during the process. Nobody wanted to interrupt. Nobody wanted to speculate. Everyone was waiting, including the judge. Finally, the clerk looked up. "Your Honor." "Yes." "The certification numbers match the registry records." Another pause. "All documents appear authentic." Walter saw Ethan Brooks close his eyes briefly, just once, a tiny movement, gone almost immediately, but Walter noticed, because small reactions often revealed more than large ones. Judge Whittaker thanked the clerk, then returned to the trust documents. For nearly 5 minutes she read without speaking. 5 long minutes. The courtroom became almost motionless. Nobody seemed willing to break the silence. Not reporters, not observers, not attorneys, not even Lauren. Walter looked across the room. She sat perfectly still. The confident posture from earlier remained. But something else had appeared. Stillness. Not the relaxed stillness of someone expecting victory. The careful stillness of someone waiting. Waiting for information. Waiting for direction. Waiting to see what happened next. Judge Whittaker finally set the documents aside, then looked toward Ethan Brooks. "Mr. Brooks!" He stood immediately. "Your Honor!" The judge held up the certified trust record. "This document establishes the trust existed prior to the marriage." "Yes, Your Honor." "It also establishes ownership interests remained separate." Ethan hesitated, a dangerous thing to do in front of a judge, especially after spending months making ownership arguments. "Based on this record," Judge Whittaker continued, "that appears correct." Another silence, this one heavier than the last because everyone understood what it meant. The foundation supporting several major property claims had just weakened significantly, not entirely, but significantly. Rebecca remained seated. She didn't smile, she didn't celebrate. Walter appreciated that. Victory often looked strongest when it wasn't advertised. The judge turned another page, then another. Eventually, she reached the section that concerned Walter most. The forensic findings, the disputed amendment, the forged signature. Judge Whitaker tapped the document lightly. A small sound, loud in the quiet courtroom. Let's discuss this amendment. Nobody moved, nobody interrupted. The judge continued. We now have a certified trust history that does not reflect this amendment. She held up the disputed filing, and we have expert findings challenging its authenticity. Her eyes moved toward Cynthia Prescott, then Ethan Brooks. Has either party produced independent verification supporting this document? The answer should have arrived immediately. It didn't. Several seconds passed. Then Cynthia answered carefully. No, Your Honor. The judge nodded. Another note appeared in her notebook. Walter watched her write. The notebook had become increasingly full throughout the hearing. That interested him, because judges wrote more when problems appeared. The hearing continued, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Questions now flowed toward Lauren's filings, not Walter's. Verification became the focus, not allegations. Documentation became the focus, not assumptions. Exactly where Rebecca wanted the discussion. At one point, Judge Whitaker requested additional clarification regarding the timeline. Rebecca provided it calmly, methodically, no drama, just dates, trust formation, property acquisition, marriage date, asset history, ownership continuity. Each fact reinforced the same conclusion. Mercer Commercial Trust belonged to Walter before Lauren entered his life. The trust remained separate during the marriage. The disputed amendment represented the only major contradiction, and that amendment appeared increasingly unreliable. The audience noticed. Walter could see it. People who entered expecting a predictable divorce were now witnessing something different. A documentation problem, a serious one. The reporters especially seemed interested. Several had stopped taking general notes. Now they focused on specifics, dates, certification records, forensic findings. Judges rarely cared about gossip. They cared about evidence. Evidence had finally arrived. Then came the moment nobody expected. Judge Whitaker removed her glasses, a small gesture. Yet everyone seemed to recognize its significance. She looked toward both legal teams. Her expression remained calm, controlled, professional. But her voice carried unmistakable authority. The court has concerns. Simple words, powerful words. Nobody interrupted. Nobody challenged her. The judge continued. Those concerns extend beyond property classification. Walter felt Rebecca straighten slightly beside him. Not dramatically, just enough. Judge Whitaker held up the disputed amendment. This court cannot ignore questions regarding document authenticity. The room remained completely silent. Even the reporters stopped writing, for a moment. Then the pens resumed. Fast. Very fast. Judge Whitaker looked toward the clerk, then toward the attorneys, then toward the disputed filing. Finally, she delivered the sentence that changed everything. I am not prepared to continue this hearing under the assumption these documents are reliable. The impact was immediate, not emotionally, procedurally, which was worse. A procedural concern created records. Records created investigations. Investigations created consequences. Walter understood that. So did Rebecca. So did Cynthia Prescott. And so did Ethan Brooks. The judge reviewed several additional pages, then closed the file. The sound echoed softly through the courtroom. Everyone waited. Judge Whitaker folded her hands, looked across the room, and made a decision. The court will not proceed further on the current property arguments. Another pause. Instead, she requested immediate review of the disputed filings, additional verification, supplemental submissions, and potential referral regarding document authenticity. The hearing had effectively stopped moving forward, not because Walter argued better, not because Rebecca delivered a brilliant speech, because facts had interrupted assumptions. The simplest victories were often the strongest. Walter sat quietly, watching, listening, observing, exactly as he had done for months. Across the room, Ethan Brooks no longer looked aggressive. Cynthia Prescott no longer looked confident. The audience no longer looked certain. Only Judge Whitaker seemed completely composed. She reviewed her notes one final time, then looked toward both legal teams. The courtroom waited, because everyone sensed the next words would matter, and they did. Judge Whitaker closed the file in front of her, then spoke clearly enough for every person in the room to hear. Given the concerns raised today, she paused, This hearing is concluded. The room froze. No one had expected it, not yet, not this early, not under these circumstances. But Judge Whittaker wasn't finished. Her next instruction would prove even more important than ending the hearing itself. The courtroom did not erupt when Judge Whittaker ended the hearing. Real courtrooms rarely did. Instead, something more powerful happened. People stopped pretending they understood the story. For months, the narrative had seemed simple. Successful wife, ordinary husband, messy divorce. Now that certainty was gone. Judge Whittaker remained seated as attorneys gathered their files. No one rushed for the door. No one appeared eager to move. The room felt suspended, waiting. The judge reviewed several final notes, then looked toward both legal teams. The court is referring questions regarding the disputed amendment and supporting materials for further review. Her voice remained calm, matter-of-fact, professional. Yet the statement carried enormous weight. Walter knew exactly what it meant. Judges chose words carefully, especially when discussing document authenticity. The referral wasn't a finding of misconduct, not yet, but it created a pathway nobody on Lauren's side had expected to see. Judge Whittaker continued. Any future filings relying upon the disputed amendment should be considered subject to additional scrutiny. The courtroom remained silent. Walter noticed Ethan Brooks lower his eyes briefly. Again, a small reaction. Easy to miss. Not for Walter. For months, Ethan had attacked aggressively, pressed every advantage, demanded urgency. Now, urgency had disappeared. Verification had replaced it. That change alone represented a major shift. The judge eventually adjourned. Court staff began organizing materials. Observers slowly rose from their seats. Conversations started immediately. Quiet conversations, confused conversations, curious conversations. The reporters moved first. They always did. Several hurried into the hallway, phones already in hand. Not because they had a scandal, because they had questions. Questions attracted attention, and today's hearing had created many. Walter remained seated for another minute. Rebecca continued organizing documents. Neither seemed interested in leaving quickly. Patience had brought them this far. No reason to abandon it now. Eventually, Rebecca closed her final folder. That's enough for today. Walter nodded. Seems like it. She studied him briefly. Most clients would have been smiling, celebrating, demanding predictions. Walter did none of those things. Rebecca appreciated that. This isn't over. I know. Today's important. Walter looked toward the judge's bench. Not the finish line. Rebecca smiled. Exactly. They stood, collected their materials, then exited through the side door leading into the hallway. The scene outside felt entirely different from the one earlier that morning. Before the hearing, people had approached Lauren. Now they approached nobody. Most observers seemed unsure what to think. Uncertainty had replaced confidence, and uncertainty often led people back toward facts. Several reporters spotted Walter immediately. One stepped forward. "Mr. Kelly?" Walter stopped. The reporter continued. "Do you have any comment regarding today's hearing?" Walter looked at him. Young, professional, probably hoping for something dramatic, something quotable, something emotional. Instead, Walter answered simply, "No." The reporter blinked. "Nothing at all." Walter shook his head. "The documents speak for themselves." Then he continued walking. Rebecca followed beside him. Another reporter approached, then another. The questions changed slightly, but the answer remained the same. Walter wasn't interested in winning public arguments. Public arguments had created this situation in the first place. Outside the courthouse, snow continued falling lightly. Traffic moved through downtown Denver. People hurried along sidewalks. Life continued. The world had not stopped, even though for some people today felt significant. Walter and Rebecca reached the parking lot. Before they could enter their vehicles, Rebecca's phone rang. She glanced at the screen, then laughed softly. "What?" "Cynthia Prescott." Walter raised an eyebrow. Rebecca answered. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes, mostly listening, very little speaking. When it ended, she slipped the phone back into her coat pocket. "What did she want?" Rebecca looked amused. A conversation. About a settlement. Walter wasn't surprised, not anymore. The timing made sense. People became flexible when confidence disappeared. Rebecca leaned against her car. 2 weeks ago, they wanted everything. Walter nodded. Today, they want to discuss options. The difference was obvious, very obvious. Yet Walter felt no satisfaction, only clarity, because this had never been about defeating Lauren. It had been about protecting the truth. The distinction mattered. As Walter drove home, his phone remained silent. No messages from Lauren, no calls, no explanations, nothing. Again, he found that interesting. For months there had been narratives, statements, articles, rumors, interviews. Now there was silence. Silence often appeared when facts entered the room. Late that afternoon, another development occurred. Martin Keegan called. The forensic accountant sounded pleased. Not excited. Professionally pleased. A dangerous emotion for someone who worked with financial records. I heard. News travels fast. It does in legal circles. Walter smiled slightly. Martin continued. The referral helps. How? It means people will start looking carefully. Walter understood immediately. Careful review changed everything. Many problems survived assumptions. Few survived scrutiny. That evening, Walter sat alone in his kitchen. The house felt quieter than usual. Or perhaps he simply noticed the silence more. Snow accumulated outside. The lights from neighboring homes reflected across white lawns. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to relax slightly. Not because the case was over, because the burden had changed. Until now, he had been carrying proof, waiting for someone to examine it. Today, that examination finally began. Around 7 o'clock, Rebecca sent another message. One sentence. You were right not to rush. Walter stared at the screen, then placed the phone aside. His father would have appreciated the irony. Years earlier, Frank Kelly often repeated the same lesson. Patience feels slow until it becomes useful. Tonight, it felt useful. Meanwhile, events were unfolding elsewhere. Walter didn't witness them personally. He only learned fragments later. Phone calls, emergency meetings, conversations between attorneys, efforts to understand how the hearing had changed so quickly. The details didn't matter much. The outcome did. The confidence Lauren's legal team displayed before entering court no longer existed afterward. Facts had a way of creating humility. 3 days later, another signal appeared. Ethan Brooks formally requested additional time regarding certain filings. Rebecca showed Walter the paperwork. He read it once, then handed it back. Months earlier, such a request would have seemed routine. Now it felt revealing, very revealing, because urgency had disappeared. Urgency only vanished when certainty vanished first. The following week brought an even stronger indication. Cynthia Prescott filed notice seeking modification of several property claims. Not all. Just enough. Enough to suggest reassessment. Enough to suggest concern. Enough to suggest the certified trust records were having exactly the effect Rebecca predicted. Walter never celebrated any of it. He still woke before sunrise, still drove the same truck, still walked courthouse hallways, still repaired broken equipment. Life remained surprisingly normal. Perhaps that was what surprised him most. People imagine major victories feel dramatic. Often they feel ordinary, quiet, measured, gradual. One afternoon, nearly a week after the hearing, Walter stepped outside the courthouse during lunch. The winter air felt sharp, clean. He stood near the entrance watching traffic pass. A television mounted inside the employee lounge happened to be playing local news. A brief business segment appeared. Nothing significant, just market updates, commercial development news. Then a familiar face appeared. Grant Sullivan. The interview lasted less than a minute. Walter watched from a distance. What caught his attention wasn't the content. It was the expression. Grant looked tired, distracted, different. Again, not proof of anything, just observation. Walter turned away, finished his coffee, and returned to work. Because speculation had never interested him. Evidence did. And evidence was still accumulating. The hearing might have ended early, but consequences moved much more slowly. That was the nature of systems, slow, Methodical, deliberate, exactly the way Walter preferred them. As he walked back toward the courthouse entrance, his phone vibrated. A message from Rebecca, only 4 words. "We need to talk." Immediately beneath it came a second message. The review uncovered more. Walter stopped walking, read the text again, then slipped the phone into his pocket. Because if the post-hearing review had already discovered additional issues, today's courtroom victory might only be the beginning of Lauren's problems. Walter met Rebecca Hayes the following morning, not at her office, at one of the warehouses, the oldest one, a red brick building sitting in an industrial district north of downtown Denver. Most people drove past it without noticing. No impressive signage, no luxury architecture, no attention. Exactly the way Walter preferred it. The building had been part of his life for nearly 20 years, long before Lauren, long before courtrooms, long before anyone cared about Mercer Commercial Trust. The winter sun had barely risen when Walter unlocked the side entrance. Cold air moved through the loading area. Dust floated through shafts of pale morning light. Rebecca arrived a few minutes later. She parked beside the building and stepped out carrying a legal folder. For several seconds she simply looked around. "This is one of them." Walter nodded. "The first one." Rebecca glanced upward. The structure was old, solid, practical. The kind of property most investors ignored until someone else started making money from it. She followed Walter inside. The warehouse wasn't empty. Several local businesses leased portions of the building. A cabinet manufacturer, a commercial storage operator, a small machine repair company. Nothing glamorous, all reliable, all profitable. Rebecca walked slowly through the space, observing, the same way Walter observed people. Eventually she stopped beside a row of support beams. "So this is what they were fighting over." Walter looked around, not at the building, at the years behind it. "This isn't what they were fighting over." Rebecca waited. Walter continued. "They were fighting over what it became." That answer seemed more accurate. The warehouse itself wasn't special. The story behind it was. Several minutes later, they moved into a small office overlooking the loading dock. Walter unlocked a filing cabinet, removed an old photograph, then handed it to Rebecca. The image showed 2 men standing in front of the warehouse, one young, one older, both covered in dust, both smiling. Rebecca studied it. "Your father," Walter nodded. "Frank Kelly, the man responsible for everything." Years earlier, when industrial properties were struggling, Frank saw opportunity. Not because he was wealthy, because he was patient. The first warehouse had nearly bankrupted him. Banks didn't want to lend. Investors weren't interested. Everyone thought the neighborhood was declining. Frank disagreed. Walter remembered weekends spent repairing roofs, painting walls, replacing damaged wiring, working long after sunset. No one called it an investment back then. It was survival. The memory remained vivid. Cold winters, hot summers, endless work, slow progress. Rebecca placed the photograph back on the desk. "He would have been proud of today." Walter smiled faintly. "Maybe." The answer sounded modest, but both knew it was true. Frank Kelly believed in preparation, documentation, discipline, the very habits that had protected Walter throughout the divorce. Rebecca opened her folder. The purpose of the meeting wasn't nostalgia. There was business to discuss. The review ordered after the hearing had produced results. Several results. Most important, the disputed trust claims were collapsing quickly. Additional records confirmed ownership history, property classifications, trust structure continuity. Each new verification strengthened Walter's position. At the same time, concerns surrounding the disputed amendment continued growing. The review process had uncovered inconsistencies beyond the signature itself. Creation timelines, supporting attachments, reference materials, nothing conclusive individually, collectively concerning. Rebecca explained everything carefully. Walter listened, then asked the question that mattered. "What happens next?" Rebecca closed the folder. "The divorce continues." Simple answer. Accurate answer. "The property issues, mostly resolved." Walter nodded. That was expected. The certified trust records had done exactly what they were supposed to do. Establish ownership. Nothing more, nothing less. For several moments neither spoke. The office remained quiet. Outside, forklifts moved across loading areas. Business continued. Life continued. Then Rebecca asked something unexpected. "Why didn't you tell Lauren?" Walter looked up. "What? The trust?" He understood immediately. Rebecca wasn't asking legally. She was asking personally. The answer required thought, not because it was complicated, because it was simple. She never cared. Rebecca waited. Walter continued. "When we first met, I talked about the warehouses." A faint smile crossed his face. "She thought they were boring." Rebecca laughed softly. That sounded believable. Walter looked through the office window. "After a while, I stopped talking about them." The silence that followed felt different, less legal, more human. Rebecca finally understood something she hadn't fully grasped before. Lauren didn't overlook Walter's assets, she overlooked Walter. The distinction mattered very much. Over the following weeks, additional settlement discussions occurred. This time the tone changed dramatically. The demands disappeared, the assumptions disappeared, the confidence disappeared. Instead, negotiations focused on practical resolution. Reality had entered the room. Reality often changed conversations. Walter participated only when necessary. He left most legal discussions to Rebecca, not because he was detached, because revenge had never interested him. That surprised some people, especially those who expected retaliation. Months earlier, Walter could have gone public, shared evidence, exposed inconsistencies, encouraged media attention. He did none of it. Rebecca asked him why once. His answer remained the same. "Truth doesn't need help." The phrase stayed with her. Because most people desperately wanted audiences. Walter wanted accuracy. A rare difference. One afternoon, Rebecca called with another update. Grant Sullivan's name had surfaced again. Not dramatically, not criminally, simply repeatedly. Repeatedly enough that investigators noticed. Walter listened, then moved on. The information no longer surprised him. Patterns rarely changed overnight. The larger surprise came elsewhere, a scholarship proposal. The idea had existed for years, long before the divorce, long before Lauren, long before any legal battle. Frank Kelly believed skilled trades deserved greater respect. Electricians, plumbers, maintenance workers, technicians, people who built things, people who repaired things. People often ignored them until something broke. Walter never forgot that lesson. Years earlier, he created preliminary plans for a scholarship fund supporting trade school students. The warehouses would finance it eventually. That was always the goal. The divorce almost delayed those plans. Instead, it strengthened them. One evening, Walter walked through the oldest warehouse alone. Sunrise painted the brick walls gold. The building felt peaceful, steady, reliable, like an old friend. He carried a folder containing scholarship projections, budget estimates, partnership ideas, future plans. For the first time in months, his thoughts weren't focused on legal issues. They were focused on possibilities. The future felt open again. Not because the divorce disappeared, because it no longer controlled everything. His phone rang. Rebecca. Walter answered. "Morning." "Morning." Her voice sounded relaxed, a good sign. "What happened?" "The settlement framework is nearly finalized." Walter nodded, not surprised. The process had been heading there for weeks. Rebecca continued. "The trust remains entirely separate. Expected. The property claims are gone." Also expected. Walter looked across the warehouse floor. Sunlight continued moving through high windows. Dust drifted through the air. Quiet, steady. Rebecca wasn't finished. "There may be additional proceedings regarding the disputed filings." Walter listened, then gave the same answer he always gave. "Whatever the system decides." Rebecca smiled. Even over the phone she could hear it. The absence of bitterness, the absence of vengeance. Most clients wanted punishment. Walter wanted facts. The distinction never stopped impressing her. After the call ended, Walter walked deeper into the warehouse, past old storage areas, past loading docks, past equipment rooms, until he reached the original entrance, the first doorway he and his father repaired together. He stopped there, placed one hand on the metal frame, and looked outside. The city was waking up, traffic increasing, businesses opening, workers arriving, everything moving forward. The same way life always moved forward, no matter how loudly people argued. No matter how confidently they judged, no matter how wrong they were, the warehouse stood because someone had spent years preparing for the future. The trust survived because someone had documented everything, and Walter's reputation survived because facts eventually arrived where stories could not. He stepped outside, locked the door behind him. And as the morning sun climbed higher over Denver, he realized something. The most valuable thing he protected during the divorce wasn't money. It wasn't property. It wasn't even the trust. It was the truth about who built all of this in the first place. And very soon, the final chapter of the divorce would allow him to leave the entire battle behind. The divorce became official on a clear Monday morning in early spring. No crowd gathered. No reporters waited outside. No dramatic speeches filled the hallway. The final hearing lasted less than 30 minutes, which felt appropriate. The loudest part of the story had already ended. What remained was paperwork, signatures, orders, final resolutions, the system moving exactly as it was designed to move. Walter arrived early, as always. The snow had disappeared from Denver weeks earlier. Warm sunlight reflected off downtown office buildings. People hurried toward work. Traffic flowed steadily through the city. Life continued. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere felt completely different from the hearing that had attracted so much attention. No audience, no business observers, no curious spectators, only the people directly involved. Judge Whitaker reviewed the final settlement documents. The disputed property claims had been withdrawn. The trust remained separate property. Mercer Commercial Trust stayed exactly where it had always been, with Walter. The remaining marital assets were divided according to standard legal procedures, fairly, predictably, quietly. That was all Walter ever wanted, not victory, fairness. There was a difference. Lauren sat across the room. The months since the public hearing had changed many things. The narrator could not know her thoughts, only what Walter observed. And what Walter observed was simple. The confidence that once seemed unshakable had faded. Not replaced by defeat, replaced by reality. Reality had a way of reducing performances. Judge Whitaker finalized the order. Several signatures followed, several acknowledgments, several procedural steps. Then it was done. 11 years of marriage, officially over. Walter expected to feel something dramatic, relief, anger, triumph, regret. Instead, he felt calm, a surprising calm. Perhaps because the battle had ended long before the paperwork did. When the final documents were completed, Judge Whitaker looked toward both parties. Her words were brief, professional, respectful. Then she stood and exited the courtroom. The case was over, just like that. Walter gathered his briefcase, nothing more, no celebration, no speech, no victory lap. He simply prepared to leave. Rebecca walked beside him into the hallway. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Rebecca smiled. You know, most clients would be planning a vacation right now. Walter laughed softly. Most clients aren't me. No, they're not. They reached the building entrance. Morning sunlight spilled across the courthouse steps. The city stretched out before them, bright, busy, alive. Rebecca stopped. I have one more question. Walter looked at her. What now? She folded her arms. What are you going to do with all of it? Walter already knew the answer. The warehouses, the trust income, the future. The answer hadn't changed in years. I'm going to finish what my father started, Rebecca nodded, as if she expected exactly that, because she did. 2 months later, the Frank Kelly Skilled Trades Scholarship officially launched. The announcement wasn't large. No television cameras, no elaborate gala, no luxury ballroom. Walter preferred it that way. The event took place inside a community trade center in Denver. Students, teachers, electricians, plumbers, HVAC technicians, maintenance workers, people whose careers often went unnoticed. Exactly the people Frank Kelly respected. The scholarship funded vocational training for children of maintenance workers, custodians, and tradespeople throughout Colorado. The first year supported 12 students. The second year would support more. Walter stood near the back during the announcement, listening, watching, observing, as always. A young student approached afterward, nervous, excited, holding scholarship paperwork. Mr. Kelly. Walter turned. The student extended his hand. Thank you. 2 simple words, nothing more. Yet somehow they mattered more than anything that happened in court. More than headlines, more than legal victories, more than property disputes, because this was the reason the trust existed in the first place. Not to impress people, to help people. Months passed. Life settled into a new rhythm. Walter continued working at the courthouse. Many people expected him to retire. He didn't. Many expected him to buy a luxury vehicle. He didn't. Many expected him to move into a mansion. He didn't. The old Ford F-150 remained in the parking lot. The metal lunchbox still accompanied him every morning. The courthouse maintenance routes remained unchanged. Success had never altered Walter. Why start now? One afternoon, a deputy stopped him near an elevator. "Can I ask you something?" Walter nodded. The deputy hesitated. "Is it true you own all those warehouses?" Walter smiled slightly. "Some of them." The deputy stared. "Why are you still working here?" Walter looked around the courthouse hallway. The old stone walls, the busy employees, the familiar routines. Then he answered honestly. "Because I like it here." The deputy laughed, shook his head, and walked away. Walter continued toward the maintenance office. The conversation followed him for several minutes. People often assumed happiness arrived after acquiring something. Money, status, recognition. Walter had learned a different lesson. Happiness usually arrived when you no longer needed strangers to understand your value. That lesson had taken years. The divorce simply confirmed it. One evening, near the end of summer, Walter returned to the original warehouse, the same building he visited with Rebecca months earlier. The same building he and his father repaired together. The same building that started everything. The property remained active. Tenants occupied most of the space. Business was strong. The future looked stable. Walter entered the small office overlooking the loading dock, opened a filing cabinet, and removed a familiar item, the cream-colored envelope. The envelope that had sat inside his briefcase during the hearing. The envelope that changed everything. The envelope containing the certified trust record. For several moments he simply held it. Not because he treasured the legal victory, because it represented something larger. Preparation, patience, discipline, proof. The qualities that protected him when assumptions failed. Walter opened a drawer, placed the envelope inside, then closed it. The action felt symbolic. The battle belonged in the past now. The lesson could remain. Outside, evening sunlight stretched across the warehouse floor. Golden, warm, peaceful. Walter turned off the office light, locked the filing cabinet, and walked toward the exit. No reporters waited outside. No audience watched. No one applauded. The moment belonged entirely to him. As he stepped into the fading sunlight, he thought briefly about the day Lauren entered court with 2 attorneys believing the story was already written. She wasn't alone. Most people believed it. The quiet maintenance supervisor, the successful developer, the predictable outcome. They all looked at appearances. Very few looked at evidence. But evidence had never cared about appearances, and neither had Walter Kelly. He locked the warehouse door, walked toward his truck, and drove into the Colorado evening. Not as a man who had won, as a man who no longer needed to prove anything. Some people spend years trying to convince the world they are important. Others spend those same years quietly building something real. Walter Kelly's story was never about money warehouses or even divorce. It was about patience. It was about understanding that truth does not become stronger because it is shouted, and it does not become weaker because it is ignored. Many of us have experienced moments when people judged us by our job title, our appearance, our income, or the version of us they found easiest to believe. In those moments, the temptation to react immediately can be overwhelming. But sometimes the strongest response is not an argument. Sometimes it is preparation. Sometimes it is documentation. Sometimes it is simply waiting until the facts are ready to speak for themselves. I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been underestimated by people who thought they knew your story? What happened and how did you handle it? Share your experience in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Tomorrow's story is about another ordinary person who was dismissed, overlooked, and underestimated until one unexpected moment changed everything.